The crystal chandelier above the ballroom sparkled like 1,000 diamonds, casting dancing shadows across the marble floor. Victoria Chen stood at the edge of her own party, watching 300 of the city's most powerful people laugh and chat over champagne that cost more than most people made in a month. She should have been happy. After all, this was her annual charity gala, and they had already raised over $2 million for children's hospitals. Her tech company had just hit another record quarter, making her one of the youngest billionaires in the country at 32. Everything in her life looked perfect from the outside, but Victoria felt empty inside. "Miss Chen, there's someone I'd like you to meet," said her assistant, walking up with a tall man in an expensive suit. "This is Robert Williams from the investment firm downtown." Victoria forced a smile and shook his hand. Robert immediately launched into a speech about his golf handicap and his new yacht. Within 2 minutes, Victoria's mind had wandered to the quarterly reports waiting on her desk upstairs. This was her life now. Endless conversations with people who only saw dollar signs when they looked at her. Men who wanted to marry her bank account, not her heart. Women who pretended to be friends but only called when they needed donations for their pet projects. Victoria excused herself from Robert and walked toward the grand piano that sat in the center of the ballroom. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway worth more than most houses. She had bought it 3 years ago after learning to play as a child, but lately she barely touched it. She sat down at the bench and let her fingers find the keys. The room's chatter seemed to fade as she played a soft melody, something she remembered from her childhood piano lessons. The music felt like the only honest thing in her life anymore. "Beautiful playing," came a voice behind her. Victoria turned to see Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, one of the few genuine people she knew. Patricia ran the children's hospital that would benefit from tonight's fundraiser. "Thanks," Victoria said, sliding over to make room on the bench. "Sometimes I think music is the only thing that still makes sense to me." Patricia sat down beside her. "You know, I've been watching you tonight. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else but at your own party." Victoria laughed, but there was no joy in it. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been there," Patricia said gently. "Success can be lonely, especially when you're not sure who really cares about you versus who cares about what you can do for them." Victoria nodded. This was exactly how she felt, but she had never heard someone put it into words before. "I keep thinking there has to be more to life than this," Victoria said, gesturing at the crowd around them. "All these people, all this money, all these connections, but I go home to an empty penthouse every night and wonder what the point of it all is." Patricia was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What would make you happy?" Victoria thought about it. "Someone real. Someone who sees me, not my bank account. Someone who understands that there's more to life than material things." She paused, then added, "Someone who shares my passions, not just my lifestyle." "Have you ever thought about putting yourself out there in a different way?" Patricia asked. "Maybe stepping outside your usual circle?" Victoria shook her head. "I've tried dating apps, blind dates, everything, but it's always the same story. They either want my money or they're intimidated by my success. I'm starting to think I'm meant to be alone." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of someone tapping a champagne glass. Victoria's event coordinator was calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the coordinator announced, "Miss Chen would like to say a few words about tonight's cause." Victoria sighed and stood up. This was the part of the evening she dreaded most. She walked to the microphone that had been set up near the piano, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Your generosity will help provide medical care for children who need it most, and I'm grateful for your support." The crowd applauded politely. Victoria was about to continue with her prepared speech when something inside her snapped. Maybe it was her conversation with Patricia, or maybe it was just years of frustration finally boiling over. "But I have to be honest with you," she said, her voice changing from formal to personal. "Standing here tonight surrounded by all of you successful, accomplished people, I realize something. We can write checks and feel good about ourselves, but how many of us are actually living authentic lives?" The room went quiet. This was not the speech anyone had expected. "I built a billion-dollar company. I own properties around the world. I can buy almost anything I want," Victoria continued, her voice getting stronger. but I'm lonelier than I've ever been in my life. And I bet some of you feel the same way. She could see people shifting uncomfortably, but she couldn't stop now. We're all so busy trying to impress each other that we've forgotten how to actually connect with each other. When was the last time any of us had a real conversation? When did we last do something just because it brought us joy? Not because it looked good on social media. Victoria looked at the piano beside her and suddenly an idea formed in her mind. It was crazy, impulsive, and completely unlike her usual careful approach to everything. "You know what?" she said, walking back to the piano. "I'm tired of pretending. Music has always been the most honest part of my life. It shows who you really are, not who you pretend to be." She placed her hands on the keys and played a few bars of one of the most challenging pieces she knew, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The music filled the room with its complex, emotional melody. When she finished the short excerpt, she turned back to face the crowd. "Here's my challenge," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Anyone who can play this piece, all of it, with real feeling and skill, will prove to me that they understand what it means to pursue excellence for its own sake, not for recognition or reward." The room was dead silent now. Victoria felt her heart pounding, but she pressed on. "And if someone can do that, if someone can show me that level of dedication and authenticity, then maybe there's someone worth knowing. Maybe there's someone who could understand what it's like to pour your soul into something bigger than yourself." She paused, looking around the room at the shocked faces staring back at her. "So there it is," she said with a slightly nervous laugh. "Play this piece perfectly. Show me you understand real passion and commitment, and you'll have my complete attention and respect." The crowd remained silent for several long seconds before nervous laughter began to ripple through the room. A few people applauded uncertainly. Someone called out, "Victoria, you can't be serious." But she was serious. For the first time in years, she felt completely authentically herself. Several accomplished musicians in the crowd politely declined when asked if they wanted to try. They all knew Victoria's reputation as a pianist, and none wanted to risk embarrassing themselves in front of such an important crowd. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Victoria felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that she had finally said what was on her mind, but disappointment that her challenge had gone unmet. Maybe Patricia was wrong. Maybe there wasn't anyone out there who would understand her need for authenticity and genuine connection. As the last guests filtered out, Victoria remained at the piano, playing softly to herself. She didn't notice the maintenance crew beginning to clean up around her, or the quiet man in work clothes who paused in his sweeping to listen to her music with an expression of deep recognition and long-forgotten longing. David Kim had been invisible for so long that he almost forgot what it felt like to be seen. As he pushed his cleaning cart through the empty ballroom, collecting champagne glasses and wiping down tables, the echo of piano music still rang in his ears. Not the music from the party. That had been pleasant enough. But the piece the woman had played at the end, the challenge piece. That music had reached into his chest and grabbed his heart with familiar fingers. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. He knew every note, every pause, every emotional turn of that composition. Once upon a time he could have played it blindfolded, but that was another lifetime. That was when he was Daniel Kim Petrov, the boy wonder who could make a piano sing like an angel. That was before everything fell apart. David stopped cleaning and looked at the grand piano sitting silent in the center of the room. The woman, Victoria, he had heard people call her, had left hours ago, but he could still feel the passion in her playing. She had skill, real skill. But more than that, she had something he recognized from his own past. The need to pour your soul into music because words weren't enough. He remembered being 7 years old, sitting at his first real piano lesson. His mother, a classical violinist from Seoul, had saved for months to afford those lessons. His father, a pianist who had defected from Russia with nothing but his talent and dreams, had taught him that music was a language that could speak directly to people's hearts. "Play with feeling. Little one," his father would say in his thick accent, "technique is just the beginning. The real music comes from here." And he would tap his chest right over his heart. By age 10, David was winning every competition he entered. By 15, he was performing with major orchestras. The critics called him a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent. His parents were so proud they cried at every performance. but the pressure was enormous. Practice 8 hours a day, perfect attendance at lessons, constant travel to competitions and concerts. David's childhood disappeared under the weight of expectations. He had no friends his own age, no time for normal teenage activities. Just piano, always piano. The breaking point came when he was 19. He was scheduled to perform with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, a huge career milestone. The piece was complex, Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1, and he had practiced it thousands of times. He knew it perfectly, but on the night of the performance something went wrong. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the years of pressure finally catching up to him. As he sat down at the piano in front of 3,000 people, his hands began to shake. The music that had always flowed through him like breathing suddenly felt foreign and impossible. He tried to start the piece 3 times. Each time his fingers froze over the keys. The audience grew restless. The conductor looked concerned. Finally, David stood up, bowed to the crowd, and walked off the stage without saying a word. The newspapers were brutal. "Prodigy's public meltdown," read one headline. "The rise and fall of a musical genius," said another. Videos of his frozen performance went viral online, turning his moment of vulnerability into entertainment for millions. David couldn't handle the shame and scrutiny. He disappeared from the classical music world entirely, changing his name and moving to a different city. For the past 12 years, he had worked maintenance jobs, keeping his head down and his past secret. He hadn't touched a piano since that night in Chicago. But tonight, hearing Victoria play that Rachmaninoff piece, something stirred inside him that he thought was dead forever. After finishing his cleaning duties, David found himself alone in the ballroom with the piano. The building was empty except for the security guard, who was probably watching TV in the lobby. David approached the instrument slowly, like it might bite him. He lifted the piano bench cover and sat down. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. What if he had lost it completely? What if 12 years of silence had erased everything he once knew? He pressed down on middle C. The note rang clear and true in the empty room. Then he played a simple scale, his fingers remembering the familiar pattern. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of avoiding anything that reminded him of music. Slowly, carefully, he began to play a simple melody. Nothing fancy, just something his father had taught him when he was very young. His fingers felt rusty, uncertain. But gradually the music began to flow again. He thought about Victoria's challenge. "Play the Rachmaninoff piece perfectly," she had said, "and prove that you understand real passion and commitment." She was looking for someone who knew what it meant to dedicate everything to something beautiful. David certainly knew about dedication. He had given his entire childhood to music. But he also knew about failure, about what happened when the pressure became too much to bear. Still, something about Victoria's loneliness called to him. He had heard the sadness in her voice when she talked about authentic connections. He understood that feeling. For 12 years he had lived as a shadow of himself, too afraid to be real with anyone. Over the next few weeks, David began arriving at work earlier and staying later. The building management didn't mind. They were happy to have such a dedicated employee. But David's real reason for the extra hours had nothing to do with cleaning. He was teaching himself to play again. It was painful at first. His fingers had lost their strength and flexibility. Notes that once came effortlessly now required careful concentration. But slowly, night after night, the music returned to him. He started with simple pieces, then gradually worked up to more complex compositions. The Rachmaninoff Concerto was still too difficult, too connected to his past trauma. But he was getting closer. What surprised him most was how different his playing felt now. As a young prodigy, his technique had been flawless but somewhat cold. He had been so focused on perfection that he sometimes forgot about emotion. Now, after years of loss and struggle, his music carried a depth it had never had before. Victoria had said she wanted someone who understood real passion. David was beginning to think that maybe real passion wasn't just about talent or technical skill. Maybe it was about having something important to say through your music, something that came from living life fully, including the difficult parts. He began to wonder what Victoria's story was. Why was someone so successful and accomplished so lonely? What had driven her to make such an unusual challenge in front of all those people? Sometimes late at night when he was practicing, David would imagine what it might be like to actually accept her challenge. Not for marriage, that was clearly just dramatic flair, but for the chance to connect with someone who might understand what music really meant. But that was just a dream. He was a night janitor with a secret past, and she was a billionaire living in a different world entirely. Even if he could play the Rachmaninoff perfectly again, even if he could overcome his stage fright, what could someone like him possibly offer someone like her? Still, night after night he kept practicing. The music was calling him back to life, and for the first time in 12 years David was beginning to remember who he used to be. Or maybe, he was discovering who he was meant to become. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria's charity gala, and she couldn't stop thinking about her impulsive challenge. Her friends thought she had lost her mind. Her business partners were concerned about her erratic behavior, going viral on social media. But Victoria didn't care. For the first time in years, she had said exactly what she was feeling. The problem was nothing had changed. She was still alone, still surrounded by people who only saw her money and status. If anything, word of her piano challenge had made things worse. Now she was getting messages from men claiming to be concert pianists, sending her videos of themselves playing badly recorded versions of classical pieces. Victoria threw herself into work, staying late at her office most nights. Her company was developing new artificial intelligence software, and the project required her constant attention. But even the cutting-edge technology couldn't distract her from the emptiness she felt inside. It was during one of these late work sessions that she first heard it. Victoria was reviewing code on her computer when a faint sound drifted up from the floors below. At first she thought it was just the building's sound system or maybe someone's phone playing music. But as she listened more carefully, she realized it was live piano music coming from somewhere in the building. She saved her work and walked to the window that overlooked the ballroom. The lights were dim, but she could see the outline of someone sitting at her piano. Whoever it was played with a hesitant but beautiful touch. The melody was simple, something that sounded like a lullaby. But there was an emotional depth to it that made Victoria's chest tighten. Who could be in her building this late at night? And who would have the nerve to use her piano without permission? Victoria grabbed her security card and headed downstairs. But by the time she reached the ballroom, it was empty. The piano bench was pushed back slightly, and the keys were still warm to the touch, but whoever had been playing was gone. This happened 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Always late at night. Always when Victoria was working alone in the building. The mysterious pianist played different pieces each time, sometimes classical, sometimes more modern compositions. But every performance had that same quality, technically imperfect but emotionally rich. Victoria became obsessed with catching her midnight musician. She started working even later, keeping her office door open so she could hear better. She asked the security guard, but he claimed he never saw anyone near the piano during his rounds. The music was beautiful, but it was also frustrating. This unknown person was playing her piano in her building and somehow managing to stay completely invisible. Victoria was used to being in control of everything in her world, and this mystery was driving her crazy. But there was something else. The more she listened to the nighttime playing, the more she realized that this musician understood something about music that she had been missing. Victoria's own playing was technically perfect. She had studied with the best teachers and practiced religiously. But this stranger played with a raw honesty that her classical training had never taught her. One night, the music was particularly moving. The pianist was working on something complex, stopping and starting, clearly struggling with difficult passages. Victoria could hear the frustration in the repeated attempts, but also the determination. This wasn't someone showing off or playing for an audience. This was someone working through something personal, using the piano as a way to process emotions. Victoria found herself getting emotional just listening. When was the last time music had made her feel this way? When had she stopped playing for the joy of it and started playing only to prove her skill? She began to wonder about the person behind the music. Who were they? What was their story? Why were they practicing in secret? And why did their playing sound like it carried the weight of real-life experience? David, meanwhile, was completely unaware that anyone was listening to his late-night practice sessions. He had gotten into a routine of staying after his cleaning shift to work on rebuilding his musical skills. The Rachmaninoff piece was getting easier, though he still couldn't play it all the way through without stopping. Each night, he felt more of his old abilities returning. But something was different now. When he was younger, he had played to impress people, to win competitions, to make his parents proud. Now he played because the music helped him process 12 years of silence and regret. He thought often about Victoria's challenge. Not because he was seriously considering accepting it, but because he understood what she was really asking for. She wasn't looking for technical perfection. She was looking for someone who knew what it meant to care deeply about something, to sacrifice for it, to find meaning in it. David definitely knew about sacrifice. He had given up everything for music once before, and then he had given up music itself when the pressure became too much. Now he was trying to find a middle path, a way to love music without letting it destroy him. The Rachmaninoff was becoming easier each night, but David wasn't sure if he would ever have the courage to perform it for anyone else again. The memory of his breakdown in Chicago was still too fresh, too painful. What if he froze up again? What if the same thing happened? But as he played night after night in the empty ballroom, something inside him was healing. The music was teaching him to trust himself again, one note at a time. Victoria, listening from her office window, was going through her own transformation. The mysterious midnight concerts were changing how she thought about music and about connection. This unknown pianist was sharing something real with her, even without knowing she was there. It was the most authentic interaction she had experienced in years. She began to realize that her challenge at the gala had been too focused on perfection. What she really wanted wasn't someone who could play flawlessly. She wanted someone who could play honestly, someone who understood that music was about communication, not just demonstration. The nightly concerts continued for another week. Victoria found herself looking forward to them, even planning her work schedule around them. The music had become the best part of her day, a reminder that there was still beauty and authenticity in the world. Then one night, the music stopped in the middle of a piece. Victoria heard what sounded like someone crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Her mysterious pianist was having some kind of emotional breakthrough. Without thinking, Victoria left her office and headed downstairs. She moved quietly, not wanting to scare away the person who had been bringing such beauty into her lonely evenings. As she approached the ballroom, she could see a figure hunched over the piano keys. It was a man in work clothes, someone she vaguely recognized but had never really noticed. He was clearly struggling with something deeper than just the music. His shoulders were shaking and his hands were pressed against his face. Victoria stopped in the doorway, unsure what to do. Part of her wanted to approach and offer comfort. Part of her wanted to respect his privacy and slip away. But mostly she felt a deep recognition. This person, whoever he was, understood the same loneliness and longing that had driven her to make that desperate challenge weeks ago. For the first time since her gala, Victoria felt like she wasn't alone in the world. There was someone else out there who knew what it meant to pour your heart into music, to struggle with perfectionism and fear, to search for authentic connection in a world full of superficial interactions. Standing in that doorway, watching a stranger cry over her piano, Victoria realized that her answer to the challenge might have been there all along, hiding in plain sight. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway, watching the man she now realized had been her secret pianist. He was still hunched over the keys, completely unaware of her presence. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs, and she could see tears dropping onto the piano bench. She should leave, she knew that. This was clearly a private moment, and she was intruding. But something kept her feet planted where they stood. Maybe it was the weeks of wondering about this mysterious musician, or maybe it was the recognition of her own pain reflected in his posture. David wiped his eyes with his sleeve and straightened up. He placed his hands back on the keys and began to play again. This time it was the Rachmaninoff piece, Victoria's challenge from the gala. But he played it differently than she had ever heard it before. Where the original composition was bold and dramatic, his version was gentle and heartbreaking. Every note seemed to carry the weight of loss and hope at the same time. Victoria found herself holding her breath. This wasn't just someone playing a difficult piece of music. This was someone telling their life story through sound, sharing secrets that words could never express. As David played, his technique became more confident. His fingers found their way through passages that had stumbled him in previous nights. It was as if the emotional release had unlocked something inside him, allowing the music to flow more freely than it had in years. When he reached the end of the first movement, David paused. He sat quietly for a moment, then began to speak to the empty room. "I used to be able to play this piece perfectly," he said softly, "back when perfect was all I cared about. Before I learned that being perfect doesn't mean anything if you're not being real." Victoria's heart skipped. She had never heard anyone put into words exactly how she felt about her own achievements. David continued playing, moving into the second movement. "I spent so many years trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be. The perfect prodigy, the ideal son, the rising star, but I never stopped to ask what I wanted to be." His playing grew stronger, more confident. Victoria could hear the difference between this performance and his earlier attempts. Something had shifted inside him. "I thought I had lost this forever," David said during another pause. "After Chicago, after the breakdown, I convinced myself that I wasn't meant for music anymore, that I had used up all my chances and failed." Victoria's eyes widened. "Chicago? Breakdown?" She racked her brain, trying to remember if she had heard about a classical musician having some kind of public failure. David began the final movement, the most technically challenging part of the concerto. His hands moved across the keys with growing assurance, muscle memory combining with emotional truth to create something beautiful. "But maybe failing was the best thing that ever happened to me," he said as he played. "Maybe I needed to lose everything to figure out what really mattered. Maybe I needed to be broken before I could be whole." The music soared through the empty ballroom, filling every corner with sound. Victoria felt tears streaming down her own face as she listened. This man, this stranger she had barely noticed in 3 years of seeing him clean her building, was expressing everything she had been feeling but couldn't put into words. When David finished the piece, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I heard your challenge that night," he said, "and I wanted so badly to step forward, to play for you, to show you that I understood what you were really asking for. But I was too scared, too afraid of failing again, too afraid of being seen." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. He had been there that night. He had heard her desperate plea for authenticity and connection. "But these past few weeks, playing here in the dark, I've started to remember something," David continued. "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being true. It's about finding a way to say what you can't say any other way." He turned slightly on the bench, and Victoria caught a glimpse of his profile in the dim light. There was something familiar about his face, but she couldn't place it. "I know I'm just the guy who cleans this place," David said with a sad smile. "I know someone like you would never look twice at someone like me. But if I could go back to that night, if I could have one moment of courage, I would play this piece for you. Not because I want to marry you, though you seem like an amazing person, but because I want you to know that you're not alone." Victoria felt her heart breaking and healing at the same time. This man understood her loneliness, her search for authenticity, her need to connect with someone who valued substance over surface. She took a step forward before she could stop herself. The movement caught David's attention, and he spun around on the piano bench, his eyes wide with shock and embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, starting to stand up. "I know I shouldn't be using your piano. I can explain." "Don't apologize," Victoria said softly, stepping fully into the ballroom. "Please don't apologize for the most beautiful music I've heard in years." David stared at her, speechless. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "I've been listening," Victoria admitted, walking slowly toward the piano. "For weeks I've been working late just to hear you play. I became obsessed with figuring out who was making such incredible music in my building." "You heard me playing?" David asked, his voice barely audible. Victoria nodded. "Every night, and every night, I heard something in your music that I've been searching for my whole life. Real emotion, honest expression, the kind of authenticity that can't be faked or taught." She reached the piano and stood beside it, looking down at David, who was still sitting on the bench. "What you just played," she said, "that was the most moving performance of Rachmaninoff I've ever heard. Not because it was perfect, though it was beautiful, but because it was real. You played it like you lived it." David looked up at her, and for the first time, Victoria really saw him. Not the invisible maintenance worker she had barely noticed, but a person with depth and pain and extraordinary talent. "I did live it," David said quietly. "Every note of loss, every phrase of hope. This piece became my story without me even realizing it." Victoria sat down on the bench beside him, just as Dr. Rodriguez had done with her weeks earlier. Tell me your story, she said gently. Tell me who you really are. David took a deep breath. For 12 years he had hidden his past from everyone, but something about this moment, about Victoria's genuine interest and understanding, made him want to be honest. My name isn't just David Kim, he began. It used to be Daniel Kim Petrov, and once upon a time I was supposed to be the next great classical pianist. Victoria's eyes widened as recognition dawned. Daniel Kim Petrov, the prodigy who disappeared after... She paused, not wanting to hurt him. After I fell apart on stage in front of 3,000 people, David finished. After I proved that talent without emotional maturity is just a house of cards waiting to collapse. Victoria reached out and gently touched his hand. After you learned that being human is more important than being perfect. For the first time in 12 years, David felt truly seen by another person. And for the first time since her gala challenge, Victoria felt like she had found what she was looking for. 6 months later, Victoria stood backstage at the city's most prestigious concert hall, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her black evening gown. Through the curtains, she could hear the murmur of 800 people taking their seats. In just a few minutes, she would walk onto that stage and do something she had never imagined possible. Are you nervous? David asked, appearing beside her in his formal concert attire. He looked completely different from the maintenance worker she had discovered that night in her ballroom. Tonight, he looked like the accomplished musician he had always been inside. Terrified, Victoria admitted with a laugh. I've given presentations to thousands of business leaders, but this feels completely different. David smiled and took her hand. That's because this time you're not trying to impress anyone. You're just sharing something beautiful. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of discovery for both of them. After that emotional night in the ballroom, they had spent hours talking about their lives, their fears, and their dreams. Victoria learned about David's childhood as a prodigy, the pressure that had broken him, and his 12-year journey to find himself again. David learned about Victoria's loneliness at the top, her struggle to find authentic connections, and her realization that success without meaning was just an expensive form of emptiness. They had started meeting regularly, not as a billionaire and her employee, but as two people who understood what it meant to search for something real in a world full of pretense. Sometimes they would talk for hours over coffee. Other times they would sit at the piano together, sharing music and stories. David had been hesitant to return to professional music. The trauma of his breakdown was still fresh even after all these years. But Victoria had seen something in him that he couldn't see in himself. Not just talent, but wisdom earned through suffering. She encouraged him gently, never pushing, always supporting. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, she had told him one evening as they practiced together, but you have something beautiful to share with the world. It would be a shame to keep it hidden forever. The turning point came when Victoria suggested they perform together, not as part of some grand comeback tour, but as a way to celebrate what they had found in each other. She had arranged tonight's concert as a fundraiser for music therapy programs, combining her business skills with their shared passion for music. Ladies and gentlemen, came the announcement from the stage. Please welcome Victoria Chen and David Kim for an evening of music and hope. The applause was warm but uncertain. Most people in the audience knew Victoria as a tech billionaire, not a musician. And David had been out of the public eye for so long that few people remembered Daniel Kim Petrov, the former prodigy. They walked onto the stage together, Victoria in her elegant gown and David in his classic black tuxedo. 2 grand pianos had been arranged so they could face each other while playing. The setup was intimate, designed for conversation rather than competition. Victoria stepped up to the microphone first. Thank you all for being here tonight, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what success looked like. I had built a company, made money, achieved everything I thought I wanted, but I was missing the most important thing, genuine human connection. She gestured toward David, who was standing quietly beside his piano. This man taught me that real success isn't about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to be authentic even when it's scary. David stepped up to share the microphone. And this woman taught me that failure isn't the end of the story, he said. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a better chapter. They moved to their respective pianos. The piece they had chosen was ambitious. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 arranged for 2 pianos. It was the same piece from Victoria's challenge, but tonight it would tell a different story. As they began to play, something magical happened. Victoria's technical precision blended perfectly with David's emotional depth. Her classical training provided the structure while his lived experience provided the soul. Together, they created something that neither could have achieved alone. The audience, which had been politely attentive at the start, gradually became completely absorbed. This wasn't just a performance. It was a conversation between two people who had found in music a way to express what words couldn't capture. During the softer passages, Victoria and David would catch each other's eyes across the space between their pianos. In those moments, the hundreds of people in the audience seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, sharing something precious and true. When they reached the dramatic climax of the piece, both pianos soared together, filling the concert hall with sound that seemed to lift everyone present. Victoria felt tears on her cheeks, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. For the first time in her adult life, she felt completely, authentically herself. David, meanwhile, was experiencing something he had never felt before. As a young prodigy, his performances had been about proving his worth, meeting expectations, chasing perfection. But tonight he was simply sharing his heart. The stage fright that had paralyzed him 12 years ago was nowhere to be found. Instead, he felt free. As the final notes faded, the audience sat in stunned silence for several seconds. Then someone began to clap, and suddenly the entire hall erupted in applause. People were standing, cheering, some wiping away tears of their own. Victoria and David stood up from their piano benches and moved toward each other in the center of the stage. Without thinking about the hundreds of eyes watching them, David took Victoria's hand and pulled her into a gentle embrace. "We did it," he whispered in her ear. "No," Victoria whispered back. "We found it." Later, at the reception following the concert, people kept approaching them to share how the music had moved them. But Victoria and David barely heard the compliments. They were too busy marveling at what they had discovered together. "So what happens now?" David asked as they stood on the balcony of the concert hall, looking out at the city lights. Victoria smiled. "Now we keep making music together, not because we have to, but because we want to." She had stepped down from the day-to-day operations of her company, choosing instead to focus on the music therapy foundation they had started together. David had begun teaching piano to young musicians, helping them learn not just technique but emotional resilience. Their story had become legendary in the city: the billionaire who gave up chasing perfection and the janitor who found his voice again. But to Victoria and David, the real miracle wasn't the dramatic transformation. It was the simple fact that they had found each other. "You know," Victoria said, leaning against the balcony railing, "I spent so many years looking for someone who could play that Rachmaninoff piece perfectly. I never realized I was really looking for someone who could help me play it perfectly." David laughed. "And I spent 12 years thinking I had lost my gift. I never realized that the gift was never just about the music. It was about finding someone to share it with." As they stood there together, watching the city sleep below them, both Victoria and David understood something that all their individual success had never taught them. The most beautiful music comes not from perfect technique or flawless performance, but from two hearts beating in harmony, creating something together that neither could create alone. Their love story had begun with a challenge issued in loneliness and desperation. "Bo,